There we go. Okay, welcome everybody. This is Betsy Hill. I'm president of BrainWear Learning Company. I want to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon on the cognitive impact of poverty and implications for teaching. We are recording our session today. Also, I posted, I need to restart streaming. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so let me see if I can do that really quickly here. While we're doing that, I'll just also share with you that I posted a link in the chat window where you can download the slides. Perhaps Karen can repost that for those who may not have been on yet when we posted that. If you did request a certificate of participation, we will be taking care of that following the webinar. We have a pretty sizable attendance today, so if you would give us a week to get those processed, that would be great. If you don't see it by then, you might also check your spam folder. Every once in a while, those certificates end up there for no explainable reason. As we go along today, I hope you will share your questions in the chat window or in the Q&A window, either one. My colleague Karen is going to be monitoring them and will answer those that she can and make sure that we track the others. So here's what we're all about today. This presentation is similar to one that I gave about 3.5 years ago. It was one of the most popular webinars we've ever done, and the topic is still very, very relevant, perhaps even more so today. And there's some new research, particularly the work that we've been doing with schools over the last several years, and I'm very excited to share that with you. So I'll be looking at some of the research in the field in terms of the impact, and then we're going to look at, of course, implications for teaching, and really hitting on these. Okay, I'm not able to stream to Facebook today, so I don't know why, but that's just the way it is, unfortunately. This is a picture, of course, of a brain. Each of us is born with one, and hopefully we keep them for a while. We have about 85 billion cells called neurons. And our brains develop by creating trillions of connections among all of those billions of neurons. And while some of that growth is guided by genetics, it's in interaction with the environment that our brains really develop. Before we get into the research, I think it's helpful just to review a few principles of brain growth and function. We have a wide variety of audience today, so I think that this will be helpful just to give everybody, make sure everybody's got some of the basics. So this is an illustration of 3 neurons and how they connect to each other. Each neuron in our brains has about 6,000 dendrites. The dendrites are like tree branches reaching out to receive messages from other neurons. They account for about 90% of the cell surface. Each neuron also has one axon, which is the outbound messaging. The neuron sends an electrical signal down the axon, and when it gets to the place where the axon connects with the dendrites of another neuron, chemicals are released into that space, and that space is called the synapse. Neurons communicating with each other is the basis of all human behavior. You can see that the axon here, the one on the left-hand side, has what looks like a little coating here, almost like sausage links, and that's a coating called myelin. It's a fatty substance that helps sort of like insulation for an electrical cord, but it's helps the signal travel faster and with more integrity down that axon. And the more a particular pathway is used, the more myelin will be created as it is used repeatedly. And it makes it more efficient and the communication faster. So this will give you somewhat of a sense for how many connections are actually made among the neurons in our brains. This is an actual slide of brain tissue, but enlarged many, many times. 30,000 neurons would fit on the head of a pin. And all of these neurons and all of their connections are what people refer to when they talk about the gray matter in the brain. The white matter refers to the myelin sheath that coats the axons as the brain develops and becomes more mature and gets faster and better at those particular pathways that are frequently used. So I'll talk a little bit about how the brain grows. Tremendous growth, of course, to get ready for the brain to come out with all the neurons it will ever need. In fact, 250,000 a minute during our fetal development. 85 billion neurons, and it weighs about 1 pound. Now, an adult brain weighs about 3 pounds. So by the first year, during that first year, the brain essentially doubles in size. And by the age of 5 or 6, it's 90% of its adult size and weight. And I want to just get everybody thinking a little bit. What do you think causes this tremendous growth in such a short time? The answer is not more neurons. Remember, we are born with essentially all the neurons we will ever need and ever have. It's not bigger neurons. What it is more connections among neurons. And this is a slide that really shows that in a very impactful way. So these are slides of actual brain tissue from the cortex, the outer layers of the brain, at birth and at 2. And this is really a picture of learning. The formation, the connection, the making and strengthening of those connections among all those neurons into neural networks. It turns out that the 2-year-old brain actually has too many connections, and we'll start pruning away the ones that aren't as useful. And this dramatic synaptogenesis, as they call it, this production of synapses in the brain, the connections among the neurons, happens twice in our lifetimes, at 2 and then again in adolescence. And while those 2 periods of development are remarkable, our brains are constantly developing throughout our lives. We're always making and losing connections among our brains throughout our entire lifetime. So now that we have a little bit of a sense of what's happening as brains develop, we want to talk about now and turn to the impact of the environment. So as we said before, it's a combination of genetics and the environment. And this was shown very pointedly in work that began in the 1960s with Marion Diamond. She and her colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, demonstrated that substantial changes in brain architecture can be influenced by an animal's environment. Somewhat later, William Greenough at the University of Illinois also extended that research on enriched environments. So an enriched environment, you're seeing a couple of different cages with each one with a rat, because that was the work has been done. And for a rat, an enriched environment includes having a large cage with a lot of toys, also typically with a colony of rats, friends to play with. And the toys were changed regularly, not too often because that made the rats neurotic, but every few days they would change the toys and give them something new to do and to play with. And what do you think happened? Well, the brains of the rats in the enriched environment had more branching of dendrites and somewhat increased cell weight. And these structural changes also resulted in them being better able to solve a complex maze. This is not maybe a complex maze, but it gives you the idea. And she found the same thing no matter whether the rats were infants, adolescents, middle-aged, or elderly. Fortunately, a rat lifetime is only 600 to 900 days, in that range, so you can see multiple generations in a reasonably short period of time in research. But in the impoverished environment, the exact opposite occurred. So what she found is if the rats were moved from an enriched environment to an impoverished environment, The neurons decreased in size, the dendrites shriveled, and in extreme impoverishment, neurons were actually lost. Now, the fact that today we have all kinds of wonderful brain scanning technology means that we can see the same kind of impact in humans. And of course, we don't do a randomized controlled trial and put some children in an enriched environment and some children in an impoverished environment, at least intentionally to study them. It would not be ethical. But the real world provides a lot of fodder for research and a lot of many subjects who've experienced a wide range of socioeconomic backgrounds. So this chart is from a study conducted by Jamie Hansen at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And in this research, they used MRIs to measure the amount of gray matter in the brains of children. So remember that gray matter is like measuring the number of connections in the brain. So it's going to reflect the level of development and interaction with the environment to help grow and develop the brain. In this study, socioeconomic status was total family income, and there was quite a wide range. It went from 4% of the federal poverty level up to 400% of the federal poverty level. And what they found was more gray matter by volume in the brains of children from high socioeconomic status and less in those from lower socioeconomic status. And it turns out that was also true of white matter, which remember is that myelin coating we talked about. So higher SES is correlated with more neuronal connections and also more efficient neuronal connections. Similar research with very similar conclusions was conducted by Joan Luby at Washington University in St. Louis. This was published in JAMA. And again, looked at with MRIs, scans at children from different levels of economic status. They used a slightly different measure here, the income to needs ratio, so it accounted for the size of the family a little bit more precisely than the other one. And again, looking at the contribution of the that ratio, that level of economic stability or lack thereof, to brain volume. Both gray matter and white matter volume correlated with socioeconomic status, again, in this study. But there were also some other important findings in both of the research, particularly regarding the areas of the brain that were impacted, where they really saw these differences. So one of the areas of the brain where the differences were very significant in the MRI scans was the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a little brain structure that's highlighted in yellow in this picture. It's involved in short-term memory storage and retrieval and in the consolidation of long-term memory. So it's a pretty important little structure there. Differences in hippocampal volume were also seen as I said, in both studies. So think about it just for a moment, what it might mean to observe as educators and looking at children for whom this part of the brain is not as well developed. This part of the brain that actually is responsible for helping us encode memory. Food for thought. The University of Wisconsin study also measured differences in other parts of the brain, and a couple parts that where the differences were significant were the frontal lobes and the parietal lobes. Many of you probably know that the frontal lobes of our brain are important for executive functions such as planning, impulse control, control of attention, working memory. And the parietal lobes play an important role in sensory integration, aspects of visual attention, and they may be especially important for coordination and connectivity between brain regions. So what we've seen is that the pretty clear evidence that brains are physically impacted by socioeconomic status, overall composition, as well as significant differences in really important structures. But what does that mean for how well and efficiently they function, and how does that connect to what we are going to see. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a little poll where we're going to talk about digging down or coming back up, depending on how you look at to the next level. And the question here is, in your experience, what types of cognitive skills are the most affected by poverty? And so you've got several choices here: processing speed, verbal reasoning, executive functions, spatial reasoning, memory, abstract reasoning, and other. And I have not done this particular poll before. I'm going to be very interested to see what the audience experience is like here. So I encourage everybody to give us your thoughts. We're getting quite a number of answers now. About half of the attendees have had a chance to, oh, more than that. We're getting right up there. So we're still having a few responses come in. I'm going to let everybody have a chance to weigh in, as it were. All right, looks like we've sort of leveled off here, and we have about 2/3 of everybody responding. So I'm going to end the poll, and I am going to share the results. So the number one answer was executive functions. Abstract and verbal reasoning were also fairly high, but those were the areas of the most significance in terms of everybody's experience here, and we'll see how that matches up with what we have seen and what the research is going to tell us. So in addition to that research on the physical impact of socioeconomic status on the brain, we also have some wonderful research that's been done on the impact on cognitive processes. And this is research that was conducted by Kimberly Noble when she was at the University of Pennsylvania's Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. She is now at Columbia University Medical Center. And all of these areas, she talks about the cognitive system and then the cognitive function. And just want to go through this a little bit. So the first difference, of course, as you see here, is the language system. So things like phonological awareness required for reading and communication. This is consistent with the work that most educators have known about for many years about vocabulary and language deficits identified by Hart and Risley. And in those studies, children from low-SES heard 30 million fewer words by the time they were 3. And of course, if our brains are interacting with the environment and developing, we shouldn't be surprised that that area that processes words is maybe not going to be quite as well developed. But now we know that it's not just about those 30 million fewer words. The deficits impact other brain systems. So think about what it means to maybe have less strength in visual spatial relationships and spatial patterns. The impact of having, as we saw with the lesser development of the hippocampus, the ability to form new memories and assemble memories from storage. Retaining information over a short period of time, so we're talking about the working memory system, which we use all the time for pretty much anything we do consciously, particularly reasoning and problem solving. And then ultimately, the inhibitory control system, again, that's going to turn out to be an important part of executive functions, that as well. So these cognitive processes are really foundational for learning. And we would expect these differences to be related directly to achievement differences between students from economically disadvantaged families and their more advantaged peers. Now, of course, all of this, we're talking about averages and we're talking about statistics. This does not say anything about any particular individual, and there are always a range of abilities and developed capacities in every group of individuals. So what I want to do now is share a little bit of the research that we have been doing in schools over the last few years. And we're going to start by focusing on executive functions, because as it turns out, that's an area where we see particularly large differences in the work that we do. So I'm going to share some data that came out of testing in a variety of different schools. Most of these, though this first one is not a school, high poverty school, but most of the other ones are going to be. And this is the result, the data from testing using an assessment called MindPrint. It's a scientifically valid, nationally normed cognitive assessment. It can be administered in about an hour and can be administered by a classroom teacher or even by a parent. So it's very easy to use in this kind of an environment. It has a lot of other benefits as well. But what we're going to look at is the percentage of students in a number of different schools with deficits in attention and or working memory, so key executive functions. And when we say a deficit, or when we say the at-risk range, what we're talking about is scores in the bottom 16% of the population, or one standard deviation below the mean. So this is a suburban middle school where we have 32% of the students who are at risk for attention and or working memory. Here I've added data from an urban school that is on the outskirts of the urban area, so near the suburbs, but certainly less affluent than the first school. Now we have almost half of the students with executive function weaknesses. Now what I've done is added results from another suburban school near Augusta, Georgia. But here we're looking at students who were selected by their teachers for the program because they were struggling in reading and or math. So what we've done here is we've narrowed down, we've taken a subset of the population that is likely to be more likely to have issues. And what we're seeing is that we have to get to a subset, a smaller portion of this more affluent school to get that. Here now what I've done is added information from an urban charter school in Minneapolis that from the 1917-18 school year, where a little bit more than half of the students in the 5th grade classes at the school had executive function deficits. And frankly, when I first saw this, I was a little surprised because some of the other charter schools we work with at the same time have even higher proportions. So here is not a charter school, but a private school, residential school in the Chicago area that has high percentages of students who come from low socioeconomic status and very difficult family situations, a lot of trauma in their backgrounds, where we've got 60%. Here's an urban charter school in Indianapolis, where the percentage of students at risk for attention and working memory is now 70%. And here's another one. This was the urban charter school, had a good, better situation in 17-18. This year, 72% of the students in this school are at risk for attention and working memory. And I have one that's even higher. This was an urban charter school in South Bend, Indiana. So imagine that you're a teacher in some of these classes where you've got 70% plus of students. So just like the inverse of what we think of as a typical suburban middle or suburban school. Is everybody feeling a bit of empathy for these teachers? Well, it could be even worse. The students in that Minneapolis school are divided into 2 classes, and in the 17-18 school year, the students tested about the same, pretty close to the overall average. That was 53%. So the classes looked pretty much the same. Both teachers were dealing with the same kind of situation. And however, this was not planned, and they were not sorted out that way, or I assigned to classes because of this. This was after the fact. One of the teachers this year now has 87% of her students who score in the bottom 16% of the population for attention and or working memory. And so most all of these students are going to struggle with any activities that require attention and working memory processes. And of course, that is pretty much everything we do in school. Now, I focused on executive functions because the differences there are so striking and so important, because executive functions are so predictive of academic performance. But I want to share the results of testing in a couple of other areas just for comparison purposes. And so I chose here the verbal reasoning subtest, which we would expect some differences here based on things like the Hart and Risley research. And I think that was fairly consistent. That was another area that all of you identified as an area where you felt that impact. I should mention here that that purple bar, which is the urban Minneapolis school, is a mostly ELL population. And so that's not really a surprising finding there, but that is why we would have such a high proportion of students struggling in that area. But if you look at the abstract reasoning, for example, the differences are much, much smaller. And some of them are really very comparable to the higher socioeconomic status suburban middle school. So this is not about genetic intelligence. It's not about general intelligence. It's about the impact of poverty on the development of key cognitive processes that will affect learning and behavior. And that's an important point. It's important to remember that these same cognitive processes serve us in whatever we do. It will impact both academic performance and social and emotional competence. So here, if we look at 3 executive functions: working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility, I have just a little definition of each of those. So working memory we use all the time to hold information while we think about it. When we're keeping track of where we are in a multi-step solution, holding up aspects of a problem in mind, thinking about what we're reading as we're reading it, which is how we comprehend. Working memory is highly correlated with reading comprehension. So academically very important, but also socially and emotionally very important. How do you hold somebody else's point of view in mind? How do you compare it? How do you consider alternative ways to respond? That all happens consciously in working memory. So these are just different instances, basically, of the same mental process. It's just a different situation. Inhibitory control. We have to use that when we don't jump to the first solution that we encounter as we're doing a problem. And we have to use it, of course, when we're in a social situation. We don't blurt out, "That's stupid." We don't blow out somebody else's birthday cake, and we don't punch people in the nose. Hopefully we don't, when we get mad at them. And that's inhibitory control. Cognitive flexibility, when our original approach to a problem doesn't work and we need to shift, we need to think about problems from different points of view. Very much like thinking about personal experiences from different points of view and being able to change direction on the basis of new information, not sticking in our heels and getting stubborn and resisting what we're learning about in an environment. So really, here's another graphic that puts all of these skills into context. We've been looking at pieces of them. We started with neurons, and now we built up to a model that says, essentially, these skills are essential for learning, and we need to have them be strong in order to be successful at the level that we mostly attend to in an academic situation, which is near the top of this chart. We need to have those basic foundational cognitive skills that help us take in information from the outside world. Things that all of this happens non-consciously in fractions of a second. We need to have those executive functions working well. We need to have higher order executive functions. And all of that forms the foundation for learning to read, to do arithmetic and geometry and algebra, and to manage ourselves and our relationships. So I hope it's clear from my discussion so far that low SES students come to our classrooms on average, again, with brains that are functionally and physiologically different. Even given a good teaching and a safe environment, it will take them far longer to learn what they must to survive and thrive in an academic setting. They often can do very well in other everyday activities, but when it comes to academics, it's very often a challenge. But here's the really important part. Cognitive capacity, or the development of these cognitive skills, can happen. And that students who are behind, even pretty dramatically behind, can catch up once their cognitive capacity has been developed. Students with less cognitive capacity, not ability, every brain has the ability to develop, but the developed capacity can actually catch up. So now let's shift our focus to what we can do about it. We're going to look at some implications from the research, looking at understanding mediating factors, looking at teaching in a way that lessens cognitive load in the short term. We don't want to do that in the longer term because we actually want to develop those skills. We're going to look at interventions to help students catch up cognitively. We're going to talk a little bit about deficits in prior knowledge and experience and addressing the role of emotions. So when it comes to mediating factors, this comes from the earlier research that we were talking about, that actually can help or even make worse some of this development. Caregiving support and caring relationships are very strong protective factors for cognitive development for children, from everybody, but from children from low SES. Physical exercise, maybe surprisingly, is another very important factor. Building those trusting relationships with teachers as well. On the negative side, kids will experience stressful life events in their lives while they're in our classes. Offering a sympathetic ear and just listening is more effective than you may realize. Nutrition and sleep are other factors, as is exposure to violence. Of course, we can't much control those things, but we need to be aware of them. And helping students to understand that our concern about these aspects of their life, understanding these aspects of their lives and empathizing with them and helping them develop strategies to support them is not about being busybodies. Sometimes people have this sense that, well, I don't want to share that because it's not related to what's happening in school. As we've seen, all of this impacts learning. These are factors that affect learning, and learning is our business. So when we help students to understand how their brain develops and what they can do to help improve how that development occurs, that can also be very helpful. Teaching in a way that lessens the cognitive load in the short term. Here's an example of a couple of different approaches, one of which there are a variety of strategies. This also comes actually from the MindPrint platform, which provides recommended evidence-based strategies based on students' the results from their cognitive tests, their cognitive strengths and weaknesses. So here are some examples of strategies to support students with working memory, particularly those that are not as strong. Making sure the student is focused on one task at a time. Encourage them to use scrap paper. These are simple strategies that can be very helpful because it lets them not have to hold everything in working memory. Again, we said this is the short-term strategy, not necessarily the longer-term one, because we really want to build up those skills. How to double-check their work and use checklists. Teaching students to stop and summarize rather than reading a long passage and then trying to figure out if they comprehend it, to stop and summarize periodically so that they can help consolidate and chunk the information, putting less burden on working memory. And then automaticity with basic facts and vocabulary, again, puts less stress on working memory. So these are ways to relieve it. There are other approaches. This is one that we work with schools called Readable English. And basically what it does is it lessens the cognitive load of learning to read English. English, it turns out, is a particularly difficult language to learn to read for a variety of reasons. And so there's what Readable English does is a program that introduces cues embedded in standard spelling. We're not going to change the spelling of the words to help students predictably pronounce it. And so they don't have to remember rules, as many rules. They just have to remember the symbols and the 3 simple steps that are shown here. So another powerful way to lessen the cognitive load and accelerate students' ability to develop their decoding and fluency processes. I also want to talk about the potential of offering an intervention to help students catch up cognitively. I'm going to talk a little bit about BrainWear Safari, which is a software program that comes from clinical therapeutic best practices. Basically, what happens in a clinic with techniques used by speech pathologists and vision experts and psychologists and other learning specialists, and embedded in a computer so that it can be administered at scale rather than in a one-on-one kind of approach. Recommended usage for this kind of an intervention is 3 to 5 times a week for 30 to 45 minutes over about 12 weeks. So it's something that can be done as an intervention in a typical school setting over the course of a semester or so. So what I want to do is, one of the first groups we worked with, and this was using the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive battery rather than Mindprint. Mindprint wasn't around at the time. We would have loved to have used that. But these were 4th and 5th grade boys, low-SES, in a school in Indianapolis. These boys also had a history of discipline problems because, as we know, lack of academic progress and discipline issues often co-occur. And basically the orange bar represents their physical age, and those blue bars below it represents their cognitive age, their intellectual age. And as you can see, they're significantly behind. There's only one student who performed on the tests cognitively as that in a way that matched his physical age. So we often hear about students coming to their classrooms 2 to 3 years behind. And mostly people when they say that, are talking about academics. But the fact of the matter is, very often it's not just 2 to 3 years behind academically, it's 2 to 3 years behind cognitively. And so if you think about these students who are in 4th and 5th grade, whose brains are operating on average like a first or second grader, and you think about what happens when you put a 1st grade brain into a 4th grade classroom, I think you can probably all imagine what might have taken place, what that might have looked like. These teachers, their teachers used BrainWear for 12 weeks with them, and they were post-tested afterwards, again with the Woodcock-Johnson, and this is how they did. They improved their cognitive abilities significantly. Most of them surpassing what we would expect of students their age. These were not dumb kids. They had the potential, but what they didn't have was the developed cognitive capacity to succeed in school. I want to share another example with you. This was in a high poverty district in Canada, where the test in this case was the Canadian Cognitive Abilities Test, which is predictive of academic performance. And this is the whole 3rd grade population across multiple schools in the district. And you can see that on average, if you just look at the composite, or as they would say in Canada, the composite scores, students were performing below the 40th percentile on average. And afterwards, using BrainWear Safari during the first half of the year were now up above the 60th percentile, and at the very end of the year, performing at the around the 70th percentile, so 32 percentile points of improvement. Big difference for a teacher and for those students in a classroom. Students performing at the 40th percentile are going to require a lot of extra support. Students who are scoring at the 70th percentile on these kinds of tests are highly predicted to be successful in school without any special adjustment to curriculum or instruction. The odds of graduating and going to college and being successful further on are also dramatic. So we talk about cognitive measures, and I also want to take a look at some of the kind of impact that we see on academic measures. This year we had an opportunity to work with a Title I school in Florida who used BrainWear with 35 students. These students were selected by the principal and the learning specialist, so substantially behind in reading and or math. While we didn't have an opportunity to look at a cognitive assessment, we did get academic data from the students' iReady tests that are administered by the school. And iReady, the test when you take it at the beginning of the year, projects a typical growth target for the year and a stretch growth target for the year. And the stretch growth target is a goal that would enable the student to close the gap toward expected grade level performance, not just keeping up with the expected yearly, but helping them to actually close that gap. So in reading, which is what we're looking at here, 41% of these students had met their annual growth target in January, halfway through the year, met their whole growth target. A couple of students even met their stretch growth target at that time. And remember that this is cognitive training, not any additional reading. They were getting their standard reading interventions. Almost 2/3 of the students were now on track at the midpoint of the year to meet their annual growth target. I don't know about your experience. These are pretty good results for students who are mostly special ed. ESE is how they refer to it there. And the results were very similar for math. Oh, I don't know, something happened to my math chart. But they were very similar. A reminder that cognitive skills support everything we do, whether it's reading or math or social and emotional behavior or everything else. And I don't want to forget that part of it, that while cognitive skills relate to academics, achievement and behavior, academic achievement, they also relate to behavior. And so here are some of the kinds of things that teachers and parents often report and say they observe following a cognitive training intervention. The ability to follow directions, higher expectations and aspirations, greater ability to handle challenges and setbacks. When you've learned that you can handle something, you are more confident and approach more difficult tasks with that confidence and a true belief that you can do it because you've shown that you've developed those skills that you need. Just a couple more implications for teaching we want to touch on. Deficits in prior knowledge and experience is the next one. Most teachers I know bemoan the fact that some students, often many of their students, haven't learned what they were supposed to learn the year before, particularly likely to be true for economically disadvantaged students. If a child's executive functions and memory formation processes are not working as well as we would expect for their age, there is likely to be a need to reteach. Although the process of doing that will be much easier if their cognitive skills can be strengthened along with the reteaching. I've left this page blank because this is what comes to many students' minds when they hear fill in the blank, whatever it is they were supposed to know that they learned yesterday or the year before. I read something recently that said that 2/3 of millennials, if I said the word Auschwitz, would have no idea what we were talking about. You can all come up with examples, so I'm not going to belabor the point and give you them, but you've seen those blank stares and those deer in the headlight expressions when you mention things that students know they're supposed to know something about but don't remember. The last one is addressing the role of emotions. And this is getting a lot more attention lately because of understanding adverse childhood events and understanding the role that emotions play in learning. So emotions are really important. They can impede learning or they can enhance learning. For many students, social and learning encounters are survival encounters, and it's immediately a stressful situation. They go into fight or flight mode. Emotion overrides cognition. When you're having those physical reactions that you can't avoid, our brains are survival organs before they're anything else. And so when we go into that mode, it's to help us survive. But it doesn't help us necessarily think very well. Every learning experience for many students raises the question, will I look stupid? And that sets them up. So classrooms must be physically and psychologically safe, especially important for students whose lives may be a bit chaotic. And so there are some things that we can do to help reduce the stress in those kinds of environments. But we also don't want to make them catatonic. We don't want a bunch of passive, uninvolved students, because some of those hormones that in excess are stress hormones and stress neurotransmitters are also, in the right amounts, can enhance the creation of memories. And they could be used also for positive memories and the kinds of things we want students to learn. So we want them engaged, we want them excited, we want them to have a little bit of that sitting on the edges of their seats, if you will, because that's what's going to help them in the learning process. So teachers have to take care of the emotional side of things, both in terms of the safe environment as well as in creating a stimulating and engaging lesson. Remembering that if the teacher does all the interacting, and I'm violating this principle today to a significant degree, the teacher's not, the student's brain will grow. So hopefully you will all take an opportunity, and I will try to remind you when we get to the end and during the Q&A part, the most important thing you can do to help retain, or remember this kind of information is to go and teach it to somebody else. And so take a few minutes to jot down some notes, seek out a colleague that you think might be interested in this and share it with them. And that's going to be a key part of your learning process. So avoiding putting students on the spot, so having them discuss in groups and then share with what the group came up with is going to be far better from a stress-inducing point of view or a stress-not-inducing point of view than if you call on students or put them on the spot. Using clickers or paddles or one or two fingers to say whether they get it or they don't get it, that kind of feedback, you can get a really good sense of student understanding without singling students out. And there's another technique that comes from research by Cyan Belloc at the University of Chicago, who wrote a book called Choke. And basically one of the things that they showed is that students, when confronted with high stakes testing, some important test, if students had an opportunity to write about their feelings before the test, they actually did better on it. And the idea here is that getting those emotions out of the way on paper frees up space and working memory. So they're not sitting there during the test saying, oh, this test is so important, what am I going to do? They've gone through that process before they actually get to the test, and so that their working memory is freed up when they take the test. And for students who have less well-developed working memory, again, that's going to be a very effective approach. Fostering positive emotions, there are a lot of ways to do that. Making it real, how does this apply in their lives? Giving a lot of simulations, role-playing, multimedia games. And even some things that can sound sort of hokey. One teacher I know started off every day with his students saying, "I'm going to go around and everybody's going to tell me something good and new." And as they started, the students were sort of like, "Oh man, this is so cheesy." And they would say things like, "Well, my cat didn't die," as a positive thing. But over time, they got much better at it, looking for things that are good. And we know that the psychology research tells us that that's going to put us in a better frame for learning. Or a teacher who, when things got very stressful, and she could sense her own reaction maybe not being as positive, would say to the students, "Tell me a joke." And they all learned that as a cue, as a way of tackling their own stress, where they could join in and realize that they all shared in the process of making the classroom effective and helping everybody feel good and a part of it. So we've covered a lot today. We've covered the research on the impact of our environment, particularly socioeconomic status and poverty on the brain. We've talked about that from both from the physical point of view as well as from the point of view of cognitive measures. And then we translate that into some implications for teaching. Understanding mediating factors, teaching in a way that lessens the cognitive load, helping to intervene so that students can catch up cognitively, and then academically, handling deficits in prior knowledge, and making sure that we tackle emotions. So now I want to take the last little bit of time that we have and see if there are questions. In addition, I know that often questions don't come to mind right away, or you may, as you share the information with a colleague, as I suggested, hopefully, you may have a question that they ask you that you're not sure how to answer. So I wanted to offer an opportunity for anybody who's on the call today to schedule, if you want to talk about your particular school, your particular class, your particular situation, I'd be very happy to hop on the phone. And this is a way that you can find a time that fits your calendar and my calendar. So I would certainly welcome that. Okay, Karen, do we have any questions that anybody's come up with?
Gail had an interesting comment. She wrote, outside of the wonderful teaching strategies, there are outside therapeutic methods.
I'm having a little trouble understanding you, Karen. Can you just...
Okay, sorry. Outside of the wonderful teaching strategies, there are outside therapeutic methods to organize the brain, catch up developmentally to focus and attention. I am thinking of integrated listening systems and Stephen Borges' program with them that uses this listening system.
Okay, Karen, what I'm going to ask you to do, because you're breaking up some, I think we need to get you a better microphone for your computer, is I think that the comment was that there are a variety of different kinds of interventions to help rewire or develop aspects of our cognitive functioning. And there are, so if there are suggestions, maybe you could type some of that information into the chat window, if making sure that others can see it. I don't know if she shared that with the whole group or just with the panelists. And what we can do also is maybe include some of that information in our follow-up email, which we always send out to let you know that when the recording is available. I'm going to go also and check in the chat window. Adults, older teens in an environment where computer-aided cognitive training isn't available. You can, these kinds of things, as I think Karen was suggesting, can be done in a clinical setting with often that's not accessible or amenable. But what you can do actually is to, some of the best things are games, are any kind of game, you know, memory games. There's a card game called Set. That's a wonderful cognitive development tool. Anything that requires you to see patterns, hold information in your mind, those are things that it's going to take longer. It's not going to be as effective as a clinically based training program, whether it's computer based or otherwise. So that would be great. And actually, somebody's talking about Bruce Perry. I think he was actually the one who said it doesn't matter how engaging the lesson is, it's the teacher's brain that develops, not the students, if the lesson isn't designed in the appropriate way. If you are interested in any of the programs we've talked about or mentioned, there's information on our website at mybrainwear.com for BrainWear Safari, for MindPrint, for Readable English, all of which we have talked about a little bit today. Okay, people are suggesting some wonderful resources, so we will certainly be happy to share that with the rest of the group. One of the questions I had from someone who saw the invitation to the webinar, the question was basically this: whether I thought that students from low socioeconomic background needed additional supports, basically like an IEP, or whether too many of them were classified as needing those kinds of supports and had IEPs. And I said, strangely, I'm going to say that I think it's both. I think that, as we've talked about, students from less advantaged backgrounds are going to struggle if we can't provide them with the kinds of supports and the kind of opportunities to develop those skills so that they can have the same access to educational opportunities and to the content and the learning and the skills and the teaching and that we're offering them in school. But that doesn't mean they may need to be classified. In fact, I think that probably too many students are actually classified as special education. And then we struggle, of course, to support them. I've seen many schools where over 30% of the students are classified as special education. And these are not special ed schools. That's a whole different story, of course. But the point is, if we approach it with the idea that we're actually going to help them develop their underlying cognitive skills to the level that they can, they bring those skills to the learning process, along with all the other kinds of supports and accommodations and strategies that many of which we've discussed today, for example, about how we help students who have weaker working memory processes. Okay, any other questions? We're right at our stopping time, so I don't want to run on too long. Okay, all right, well, I'm going to take a look at the, I do want to give, oops, sorry about that. I do want to just make sure you all have my contact information, which I'm going to run through to the end of the presentation really quickly. There we go. I managed to do that. If there are other questions that we didn't get to, we'll take a look at them and see if we can get back to you either generally or individually. I hope I have an opportunity to continue the conversation with you. And I want to tell you how much we really appreciate your joining us today for this. It's a topic that I think is just so terribly important. And we have such a tremendous opportunity to help so many students. So I thank you for taking time to share it with me, and I will look forward to seeing you at another webinar sometime soon. Also a reminder that all of our webinars are recorded and they are all archived on our website, and we do provide professional development certificates of participation, even if you watch it, an archived webinar online, if you request it after you watch it. So I know it's the time of year when some teachers are trying to get those last PD credits in, and watching our webinars may be a nice way to do it because you can do it on your own time. Okay, that's it. Thanks again so much. I hope you all have a great day, and I look forward to talking to you soon.